In a world ruled by empires, a fragile band of colonies dared to challenge the greatest power on Earth. The dream of freedom seemed impossible, the price too high, the odds insurmountable. Yet one man, calm in chaos, unshaken in despair, rose to carry that dream on his shoulders. His name was George Washington, and his fight would decide whether liberty would live or die. The year was 1775, and the 13 colonies were on the edge of something they could barely understand. For generations, they had lived as subjects of the British crown, but now the weight of empire pressed down harder than ever. Taxes without representation, laws written across the ocean, binding people who had no voice in shaping them. For many, Britain was still the mother country, a distant protector, a source of culture and power. But for others, the bonds now felt like chains. The Boston Tea Party had shown defiance. The gunfire at Lexington and Concord had spilled blood, and suddenly the question was no longer if war would come, but whether liberty itself was worth dying for. Rebellion was no simple matter. To speak against the crown was to invite suspicion. To fight against it was to risk the noose. Families argued across dinner tables. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion, and yet the desire for freedom refused to be silenced. But anger alone could not win a war. These colonies, scattered and uncertain, needed something more. They needed a leader. Someone whose presence could bind farmers from Virginia, merchants from New York, and fishermen from Massachusetts into one cause. They needed a man who carried not just authority, but trust. That man was George Washington. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm dignity that commanded respect, Washington was not a fiery speaker or a writer of great declarations. He was something rarer. He was steady, honest. A man whose humility only made his strength more evident. When he was asked to lead the Continental Army, his response was not a boast but a confession. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." And yet, that reluctance was exactly what made him worthy. He was not seeking glory. He was answering duty. Behind him stood nothing short of the impossible. A handful of colonies with militias that came and went at will, farmers with hunting rifles, young boys eager for adventure but untested in war. Ahead of him loomed the greatest military power in the world, an empire that stretched across oceans, armed with fleets, wealth, and professional soldiers. The colonies had made their choice. War was here. The dream of liberty was fragile, and the weight of that dream now rested on the shoulders of one man. George Washington had stepped forward, and in him, millions placed their hope. The revolution had found its leader. The question that remained was whether the revolution could survive long enough to become a nation. When George Washington rode into Cambridge to take command of the Continental Army in June of 1775, what he found was not an army in the true sense. It was a gathering of militias. Farmers still smelling of the fields, blacksmiths with their heavy hands gripping rusted muskets, boys whose faces had not yet hardened with age. They stood proud, but pride did not change the fact that some had powder while others had none. Some had shoes while many marched barefoot, and discipline was almost nowhere to be found. To Washington, the picture was clear. If this force was to stand even a chance against Britain, it had to become an army. Order and discipline would decide whether liberty lived or died. So he began the hard work. He introduced drills. He established a strict chain of command. Desertion would be punished, insubordination corrected. At first, the men grumbled. They had not signed up to be treated like professional soldiers. But slowly, Washington's steady hand began to transform them. The rabble started to move in unison. The militia began to look like an army. What made this transformation possible was not just Washington's discipline, but his presence. He shared in their struggles. He ate the same meager rations, stood in the same cold camps, and wore the same wary look of a man burdened but unbroken. Soldiers looked at him and thought, if he can endure it, so can we. But the early battles nearly crushed them. In New York, the British swept the Americans aside in a series of humiliating defeats. The army was driven out, soldiers deserted, and whispers spread that the cause was lost before it had truly begun. Morale sank lower than ever, and the revolution teetered on the edge of collapse. Washington refused to give in. In December of 1776, as the year closed with despair, he chose to gamble everything. On Christmas night, in the freezing dark, he led his men across the icy Delaware River. Half-starved, exhausted, their boots leaving bloody tracks in the snow, they pushed through for one desperate strike. At Trenton, they fell upon the unsuspecting Hessians, and in a moment of fire and thunder, they secured a victory. The numbers were small, but the meaning was enormous. For the first time, the world saw proof that this ragged army could fight, and that George Washington could lead them to triumph. That night, something shifted. Washington was no longer merely the man appointed by Congress. He had become the heart of the revolution itself, the living proof that hope was stronger than despair. The struggle for independence was never a clean march to victory. It was a grind of hunger, cold fear, and desperation. George Washington knew this better than anyone. Against him stood an empire with ships that ruled the seas, regiments drilled to perfection, and supplies that seemed endless. Against Britain, Washington had farmers in patched coats, men without shoes, soldiers without pay. The test came hardest in the winter of 1777, at a place called Valley Forge. The army limped into camp exhausted from defeat after defeat. Nearly 12,000 men huddled together, building crude huts against the snow. Their breath froze in the air, their bodies weakened by hunger. Horses died in the cold, men wrapped their feet in rags because their boots had worn to nothing, and disease spread with no mercy. Each morning, corpses were carried out to shallow graves dug in the frozen ground. For many, it seemed the revolution would not be lost in battle, but starved to death in the snow. Washington walked among his soldiers every day, his own cloak thin, his own expression marked with the same suffering they endured. He could not give them shoes, but he could give them courage. He could not fill their stomachs, but he could fill their hearts with the belief that their sacrifice had meaning. Many whispered, "If the general can endure it, then so can we." His presence alone kept the army from breaking. But survival was not enough. They needed transformation. That came in the form of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who drilled the soldiers into a force that could finally stand in line, fire in unison, and fight as one. With his training and Washington's resolve, the ragged army of farmers began to look like soldiers of a nation. Still, the war dragged on. Victories came, but so did defeats. Critics in Congress questioned Washington's leadership. Rivals whispered about replacing him. Loyalists spread rumors to weaken his reputation. Every doubt, every accusation weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet he never wavered. Washington understood something vital. They were not fighting just for land or power. They were fighting for the very idea of liberty, the belief that ordinary men could govern themselves without kings or crowns. Every battle, every sacrifice was for that vision. Through the endless years of conflict, Washington carried the revolution forward by sheer force of will. He was not perfect. He made mistakes, lost battles, and sometimes doubted himself. But he never surrendered to despair, and because he stood firm, the revolution itself stood firm. If battlefields tested Washington's courage, betrayal tested his heart. Not every enemy wore a red coat. Some smiled as friends, only to wound him from within. The most painful example was Benedict Arnold. Once one of Washington's most trusted generals, Arnold had fought bravely and bled for the cause. But pride is a dangerous thing. Passed over for promotions, burdened with debts, and nursing grudges, Arnold began to feel the Congress had insulted him, that his sacrifices had gone unrecognized. His bitterness grew into treachery. He secretly plotted to hand over West Point, one of the most critical fortresses of the Revolution, to the British. The plot was discovered before it could succeed. Arnold fled, and Washington was left with the bitter taste of betrayal. To him, it was worse than facing an enemy in open battle. That one of his own, a man once loyal, could turn traitor. It cut deep into his soul. But betrayal did not end there. Soldiers deserted in droves, slipping away from camp in the night, tired of fighting without pay, tired of starving in silence. Washington begged Congress for money, for food, for clothing. Letter after letter he sent, often unanswered. He watched his men bleed not just from wounds but from neglect. Spies lurked everywhere. The British wove networks across the colonies, passing messages, spreading lies, twisting words meant to inspire into tools of division. Washington learned caution. He spoke less, trusted fewer, and surrounded himself with a tight circle of aides and informants who risked their lives to keep the army alive. Even the people he fought to protect were not always united. Loyalists stood with the crown, neighbors turned against neighbors, and sometimes entire towns refused to support the cause. Washington bore all of this in silence, carrying the burden so his soldiers would not collapse beneath it. Every act of betrayal reminded him how fragile this revolution was. But instead of breaking his spirit, it hardened his resolve. Washington refused to let bitterness rule him. He held fast to honor, reminding everyone around him that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for generations yet unborn. Through treachery, desertion, and neglect, he never let the fire of liberty go out. And that unshakable loyalty to the cause is what kept the dream alive long enough to see victory. By 1781, the tide of war had turned. Years of suffering, sacrifice, and endurance had brought the revolution to its defining moment. With the support of French allies, Washington's army cornered the British at Yorktown. The cannons roared, the trenches closed in, and finally, the unthinkable happened. The British surrendered. The greatest empire in the world had been defeated by a collection of colonies once dismissed as rabble. The war for independence was won. For Washington, victory was not a moment of personal triumph, but of quiet relief. He had carried the burden of command for years, through hunger, betrayal, and endless doubt. And now, the dream of liberty stood before him, fragile but alive. The war could have made him a king. It could have given him unchecked power. But Washington wanted none of it. In 1783, in one of history's most astonishing acts of humility, he resigned his commission. Before Congress, he handed back the power that so many generals in history had clung to with bloody fists. He walked away, returning to Mount Vernon to live as a private citizen. Across the world, kings and rulers were stunned. Here was a man who had held an entire nation in his hands and simply let it go. But America was still young, still fragile. The Articles of Confederation faltered, unity frayed, and whispers of disunion threatened to undo all that had been fought for. Once again, the people turned to Washington. Reluctantly, he answered the call, not as a general this time, but as the nation's first president. As president, he set precedents that shaped the very soul of the United States. He refused titles of grandeur, insisting he be addressed simply as Mr. President. He guided the country through its first uncertain steps, balancing power without crushing freedom. And when his second term ended, he did what no monarch ever would. He stepped down voluntarily, proving once again that leadership was not about holding power, but about letting it go with dignity. Through it all, Washington became more than the man who had led armies. He became the father of the nation, a unifying symbol in a time when division lurked at every corner. His legacy was not in the battles he fought, but in the example he left behind, that true strength is found in restraint, that true leadership is measured not by ambition, but by sacrifice. He showed the world that a nation built on liberty could endure, and that its leaders could serve, not rule. In him, America found its foundation, its moral compass, and its first proof that democracy was not a fantasy, but a living reality. Even now, centuries later, his presence lingers, in stone monuments, in the nation's capital that bears his name, and in the very idea of what it means to be an American leader. Washington was never perfect. He was human, flawed like all men, but in the moments that mattered most, he chose duty over desire, sacrifice over ambition, and principle over power. And for that, he became not just the commander of an army or the first president of a country. He became the father of a nation, whose steady hand and unshakable will gave birth to the United States of America. When the cannons fell silent and the banners of victory waved, George Washington did not claim a throne. He gave a nation its freedom. He turned soldiers into citizens and rebellion into a republic. His legacy was not just in battles won, but in proving that true power lies in sacrifice, restraint, and vision. From his hand America was born, and from his spirit it endured.